Hatfield's roots are buried deep in history. The earliest written record of our town is on a document that is probably older than the Domesday Book. It tells us the names of our Saxon ancestors: Dudda, a serf, and his daughters Deorwyn, Deerswith and Golda, Wheater, who was a beekeeper, Werestown and Werla, Kenwald and Manor. They lived, married and died more than 1,000 years ago in a tiny village around the first St. Ethelreda's church, built by the monks of Ely after they had received the land from the Saxon King Edgar. Between those humble beginnings and the Hatfield we know today stretches a glittering, dramatic history. Generations of kings and queens have visited what we now call the Old Town. Henry VIII and Charles I prayed in our church, as did Elizabeth I, who was held prisoner here during the reign of her sister, Mary Tudor, and heard the news that she was queen while sitting beneath an oak tree in Hatfield Park. In what is now the Old Palace, Elizabeth held her first Council of England and appointed William Burleigh as her chief minister. His son built Hatfield House, home of the Gascoigne Cecils, one of our country's great political dynasties. Long before that, Henry III had granted us our first market, and, surrounded by fertile farmland, Hatfield became an important link on the Great North Road from London, and stagecoaches had to struggle up the steep hill of Fore Street. And nobody went thirsty in those days. Within the tightly packed area of the Old Town, there were more than 20 pubs, 2 maltings and a brewery. Today, only 3 pubs remain. Charles Dickens, Samuel Pepys and Daniel Defoe were among famous travellers who came to Hatfield on that road, and Dickens used memories of his visits when he wrote Oliver Twist. Fleeing from London after the murder of Nancy, Bill Sykes hides in the 8 Bells. That night, he helps to fight a fire at a stately home, a fictional incident which has to be based on the blaze that nearly destroyed Hatfield House in 1835, which Dickens covered as a reporter. There was another fleeting encounter with English literature when the young Thomas Hardy briefly attended a private school in Fore Street. Then, in the middle of the last century, another change began when men drove railway lines across Britain. As the sound of stagecoaches rattling north and south faded into history, a second Hatfield began to appear. The inhabitants of the original jokingly called it California, a strange, distant place to the west. But this was to be the future, the first stirrings of a new community that would make its own history. Here would spring up churches, schools, homes, shops, business and industry. Here would be a new town, its story as dramatic as that of the old. The A1, a new road to the north, would be built. Alongside it, to land made flat by the last bitter ice age, Geoffrey de Havilland would bring us his plane makers. A town whose recorded existence goes back to a century before William the Conqueror would design, build and fly the first jet airliner in the world. And the change went on. The A1 would be buried underground with a gleaming shopping mall built above the tunnel, and Hatfield would become home to the University of Hertfordshire. It has been an eventful 1,000 years, but our story begins as the new began to emerge from the old. Steam trains changed the face of Britain, reducing journeys that had taken days into hours. Following the line of the Great North Road, the railway from London to Scotland ran through Hatfield, and land suddenly gained new value. After a reluctant second Marquis of Salisbury finally gave the company permission, 250 workmen came to live in Hatfield while they laid the first tracks. The authorities decided that 1 superintendent and 3 policemen would be enough to keep them in order. The old town was too small to accommodate so much change, so a new community began to appear less than a mile away, where previously only the workhouse had been built to keep the poor of the parish at a safe distance. In the dawning age of technology, one of Hatfield's traditional industries, the brewing of beer, became the town's major employer. The brewery manager, Thomas Christian, was also the town's fire chief and was once called out to tackle a fire at his own brewery. So the century turned. Edward VII, obliged by Lady Salisbury's feelings to bring his wife instead of his current mistress, continued the long line of royal visitors and was cheered along the Great North Road. No town in Britain escaped the horrors of the Great War. While Hatfield gave of its men, women waved the flag for victory as they produced artillery shell cases at Waters Garage. And Hatfield was where warfare took another deadly step forward. In 1916, in secret and far from the battlefields, military chiefs watched as an armoured steel box slowly rolled across Hatfield Park. After those trials, they accepted it as a weapon. The tank, dismissed by Lord Kitchener as a mechanical toy, had arrived. One of the first, a gift to Lord Salisbury from Winston Churchill, stood in the park for 50 years. As war ended, the new Hatfield was growing in size and confidence, but what happened in the old town was still more important. In 1920, the brewery, the town's biggest employer, closed, and there were fears of devastating unemployment. But life went on, often with a historical touch. The merry pageants, this one was held in 1930, recalled, perhaps even clung to, what was seen as a lost golden Tudor age. But a town cannot move forward by living in its past. An incredible change was literally in the air. Since before the First World War, Geoffrey de Havilland had been building planes. Coincidentally, one of them, a BE-2 series experimental bomber, had made a forced landing in Hatfield. But by the end of the 1920s, his company was running out of space in Edgware.
Yes, the de Havilland Company was founded in 1920 at Stag Lane in Edgware, North London. And it produced the successful little moth and series of moths, which very quickly outgrew the production capacity. And somebody said, we need a new factory, where shall we go? And several pilots took off in moths and flew around. And one of them, a chap called Clem Pike, was flying over Hatfield and saw this wonderful site and said, that'll do, that's it. It's near the A1 and it's near the station. It's easy for London. It's got good connections. Let's build there.
In the summer of 1930, the London Aeroplane Club arrived, to predictable scepticism. In a letter to the local paper, a correspondent wrote, "Aeroplanes are not at present a feasible commercial proposition and probably never will be. They are, in fact, the noisy playthings of a few wealthy men and women. These noisy playthings would have become the engines of unbelievable change."
By 1933, the headquarters building, which you can see today, and which is now a listed building with the 1930s Art Deco architecture, that was built and running by 1933, and all the aircraft assembly and design activities moved here.
Half-term for the summer season of 1926, I was at a preparatory school at Seaford, and in a field close to the school, there was a very old Avro 504 joyriding, and I can remember my mother coming down at half-term and saying, "Now, what would you like to do?" And I said, "I'd like to have a fly in that aeroplane." And that was the summer of 1926, and that was the first time I went off into the air. I really originally wanted to join the Air Force, but I was reminded by my mother that my father, who died when I was a 12-year-old, had said, "I don't want the boys to have a service career." I think he was referring to what happened after the 14-18 war. And so I thought, oh dear, I can't go to Cranwell then, or apply for that. So I must find out some other place I can go for training. And de Havilland's was one of the few successful aeroplane builders who ran a technical training school. And I wrote to them and said I would like to apply for technical training. And they arranged an interview, and that was the start of my connection, and for the 3 years training in the de Havilland Technical School.
Throughout the 1930s, Hatfield turned out plane after plane, each one pushing ingenuity, engineering and courage to new limits. The best remembered was the smallest, the DH-88 Comet Racer, conceived, designed and built in 9 months to meet Geoffrey de Havilland's insistence that his company had to enter a plane for the 1934 air race from England to Australia. The first one flew out of Hatfield on September 8, and 3 took part in the race. The one piloted by Tom Campbell Black and Tim Scott won, taking nearly 71 hours in a series of hops round half the globe that Scott later described as lousy, and that's praising it. Hatfield still praises the racer with the model outside the Comet Hotel and the full-size replica in the Galleria. Meanwhile, the presence of the plane makers was having its effects on the shape of Hatfield. In 1933, the Rural District Council began building houses on Birchwood Farm as homes for the factory's workers. And Hatfield's royal links continued when Princess Mary visited nurses of the Voluntary Aid Detachment at Hatfield House in 1930. In all its long history, Hatfield had never known a battle, but when World War came again, it was in the front line, ironically because of the aeroplane. 21 workers died when 4 bombs dropped from a Junkers 88 struck the de Havilland factory in October 1940. Minutes later, the plane was shot down and its crew captured by farm workers. And in the autumn of 1944, V-1 rockets hit homes in Selwyn Crescent and St Audrey's School in Endymion Road. But as Jack Olding switched from producing agricultural machinery to making military caterpillar tracks, ploughshares being beaten into swords, the Second World War produced Hatfield's first legendary plane.
Mosquito was one of the most versatile, high-performance aeroplanes that we built during the war. It was first flown in November 1940, and it was used for photo reconnaissance work, as a bomber, and then endless other uses. I had the good fortune to have a squadron of Mosquitoes in the night fighter role. So that it was very versatile, it was very high performance, only two people in it, as the pilot and observer or radar operator or navigator. And it was like a fighter in its speed, and it then was really exceptional because I think it was the only bomber command aeroplane that could go into Germany and out and hardly ever caught by German fighters because of its very high speed. And so compared to the Lancaster and the Halifax, which were much bigger aeroplanes with a big numbers of crew, they, with gun turrets and a lot of armament, they suffered vast losses during the war, but the Mosquito squadrons used on bombing had very low losses simply due to the very high performance. So it was a marvelous machine and a world beater.
And while Lancasters dropped the famous bouncing bombs of the dam busters, it was a Mosquito that carried them for the top secret trials in Kent.
At the peak, Hatfield was turning out 5 Mosquitoes every day. And there was one period, I think it was in March 1943, when it was very foggy for a period of about 10 days. And everybody was coming in on their bikes and building Mosquitoes and rolling them out onto the grass. And the ferry pilots couldn't get them to the squadrons because of the fog. When the fog lifted, the most wonderful sight was revealed of an airfield full of about 50, 60, 70 Mosquitoes. And of course, by then the squadrons were very anxious to have replenishments. But I have got a photograph of that wonderful sight, and it does give a measure of the war effort.
When peace came, Hatfield made what is perhaps a unique gesture. The town's war memorial lists the civilians who died in their homes, alongside the names of those who fell in battle. As the streets were decorated for parties for peace, another chapter was about to open. These children would grow up as their town began to change beyond recognition and become known throughout the world. The fame began in secret as Ronald Bishop, whose skills had produced the Mosquito, led the Hatfield design team on the DH-106, the second and most famous Comet, the first jet airliner in the world.
Britain had concentrated during the war on bombers and fighters, and we'd lost our position in transport aircraft to the Americans. The only way that Sir Geoffrey de Havilland could see to catch the Americans up was by going straight for the jet airliner. In those days, all airliners were propeller driven. The Constellation, the DC-4, and so on. And so the decision was taken, with the wartime experience of the de Havilland jet engine, to go straight for a jet airliner. This was a technically very challenging and daunting task. It meant doubling the speed and doubling the cruising altitude at one stroke. of technology. I mean, just doubling the altitude meant doubling the strength of the pressurized cabin, and in order to have a good range, it meant practically halving the specific weight of the aircraft. So these were the technical challenges, and from immediately after the war until the first flight, which was in July 1949, tremendous effort was put into testing on the ground, the structure, the systems, the hydraulics, the electrics, the power flying controls. This was the first aircraft, the first airliner ever to have powered flying controls. But on that day in July 1949, here at Hatfield was rolled out and flown the world's first passenger jet airliner, designed and built at Hatfield, with engines designed and largely built and tested at Hatfield.
But the Comet was a triumph marked by personal tragedy for Geoffrey de Havilland. Having lost one of his 3 sons in the war, he watched his second, another Geoffrey, take off from Hatfield in September 1946 in the experimental single-seater Swallow, its Goblin jet engine originally used to power the Vampire fighter. Over the Thames estuary, the Swallow exploded. Several days later, Geoffrey's body was washed ashore at Whitstable. He and his brother were buried alongside their mother in Tuin churchyard. Undeterred, Geoffrey de Havilland persisted, and triumph came less than 2 years after his son's death. On July 27, 1949, with John Cunningham, a hero of air warfare at the controls, the Comet made a series of 500-yard low runway tests on the Hatfield airstrip.
I did those 3 runs, one after the other. At the end of the run, I had to taxi it back up to the start of the runway, and then taxi it back to the experimental hangar. And I said, well, I'm happy. And the inspection said, right, you want the aeroplane to be put it up on jacks. It's been off the ground. We want to check that everything, the wheels and the undercarriage, are all in order. And they rather gave me to think that it would probably be tomorrow that it would fly. Well, later that afternoon, the chief inspector came to me and said, I'm very happy. It's all yours. This was about tea time, or 5 o'clock. And it was a fine summer afternoon. And I said, right, then, in that case, have it out, and I'll fly it.
So John Cunningham opened up its 4 howling ghost engines, and the people of Hatfield were the first in the world to look up and see a jet airliner crossing the skies. Hatfield was famous and flying on wings of success. In 1952, the first Comet bought by BOAC, codenamed Yoke Peter, started the first jet passenger service from London to Johannesburg. And that year, the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret, still in mourning for King George VI, joined Lord and Lady Salisbury for a 4-hour flight across Europe from Hatfield. In a nation still healing the wounds of war, it was a moment of soaring national pride. For Hatfield, it meant jobs and prosperity. Then, in March 1953, a Canadian Pacific Comet crashed in a storm at Karachi, and 11 people died. The disaster was blamed on natural causes, but in January 1954, BOAC's Yoke Peter flew out of Rome, then plunged into the Mediterranean off the coast of Elba. 29 passengers and 6 crew perished.
We couldn't understand what had happened, or had no idea as to why the Elba aeroplane came out of the sky, followed about a month or 2 later by a second comet coming out of the sky, again after taking off from Rome and just reaching its 35,000 feet or so cruising altitude.
The disasters could not be explained, and the Comet now had the worst safety record of any aircraft in the world. All that remained were grounded. The effect on Hatfield was devastating. More than 1,000 workers lost their jobs, and the wages of the rest were decimated. Hatfield had become a single industry town, and this was the price to be paid.
Well, it wasn't until after many months of hard work and Farnborough, the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and the Royal Navy trawling the seabed near Elba and getting up most of the bits and pieces of that first Comet, taking them to Farnborough and examining in detail and the failures or the bits and pieces, that they could then begin to see what had happened and the order in which things had happened. So we then were faced with the fact that the fuselage had failed, and subsequently it was proved it was a fatigue failure on the pressure cabin of the fuselage, which was, of course, a fantastic blow to de Havilland's, but it was something that really made de Havilland's more determined to carry on and rebuild or redesign and build the later version of the Comet.
The new Comets, when they do go into passenger carrying service, should be the most thoroughly tested aircraft in airline service.
So the Comet flew again, beating the American Boeing 707 to be the first jet to carry passengers across the Atlantic. More than 100 were built, 71 of them at Hatfield, the last completed in December 1962. Of all our planes, this was the greatest. While the Comet was rising, falling, and rising again, Hatfield had become one of Britain's new towns, as the pioneering social ideas that had created our neighbour, Welwyn Garden City, were adopted as national policy. New houses, schools and churches began to appear, and new residents, many moving out of London. There was controversy over this, with local people protesting that outsiders were being given homes ahead of those born in the town. The weather produced the two most memorable events of the 50s. In 1953, floods swept the east coast of England, but, more devastatingly, the coast of Holland. Moved by the plight of the people of Zierikzee, Hatfield forged a twinning link with the Dutch town, offering help and friendship. The waters have long receded, but the connection is maintained by regular visits. And in 1957, a freak storm caused havoc in Hatfield itself, ripping the roofs off houses in Hazel Grove.
We had not been married very long, and my baby was quite little. And we were walking around the lanes one Sunday afternoon, and my husband looked up at these houses that were being built and actually said, well, get a 50-mile-an-hour wind and the roofs will come off. And we didn't understand at that time, didn't know at that time that we'd be actually moving into one of those houses. And sure enough, the time came when there was a heavy I don't know, hurricane force winds, I suppose they were, because I think they gusted at 90 or 93 miles an hour at the time. And my baby woke up crying, and I went to the crib to pick her up, and there was dust in the crib. And I thought, where did this come from? And I looked up, and I could actually see the ceiling moving, and the ceiling dust was falling down into the cot. And So I picked her up and went into my husband and said, well, your prophecy's right, I think the roof's coming off. And I was actually quite scared at the time, very, very scared.
47 roofless houses, a grim spectacle for the people of Hazel Grove in Hatfield, Newtown, after a gale-swept night. The fierce winds raging through southern England have left a trail of havoc, but none so bad as here. Without warning, the light aluminium roofs were torn away, and 47 families are homeless.
And we went back the next morning, and the roof was, of course, in the backyard. And it was pouring with rain, and everything was getting soaking wet. And there were just hordes and hordes of people, food, cups of tea, cameras that seemed to be everywhere. And it just, to me, was pandemonium looking back. It was, however, there was so much help available. I remember looking up and seeing my neighbour, Terry Monk, helping with some of the debris. And I remember also looking at my husband and going, air conditioning, which is something I'd heard about but had never seen. We had our own air conditioning.
The 60s, that most vivid of decades, saw the appearance of Donovan, Hatfield's only pop star. But 1965 brought the death of Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, a man whose genius changed our history and who left a profound impression on everyone he met.
Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, the founder, was a very quiet, reserved, but attractive personality. He was the sort of chap who, if he saw an apprentice going through the door through which he was going, and this happened to me, he would hold the door open for him and say good morning. He was everybody was the same with him, and he was the same with everybody. He was the same with air marshals and with scruffy apprentices, and would put everybody at ease. And this, I'm sure, in many subtle ways that are hard to define, was a spirit that percolated through the whole company. It was a very nice company to work for.
Now, Geoffrey de Havilland, the founder of the company, was a most approachable and a very kindly man. And he looked on, particularly the students in the company, as almost members of his family, because he certainly took a very great interest in all the technical school students, who came not only from England, because we had people from overseas countries, and he looked on them as being eventually ambassadors for de Havillands. So he took a real interest in them, and his three sons, all of course round about my age. One got to know them, and one could only admire marvelously the enthusiasm with which Father de Havilland really enjoyed his work and aeroplanes.
The 1960s saw a rebuilding program that totally altered both the old and new towns. But one of the biggest changes was not planned.
The main line to Scotland blocked and the road over it out of action. That was the result after the 100-year-old Wrestlers Bridge collapsed near Hatfield Station. Had this been the only way to the north, it would have been a very serious breakdown, road and rail. Fortunately, while Operation Clear Up went ahead, trains were diverted, and the old Great North Road, which the bridge carried, has less than its former importance.
Then the Great North Road, which had been a busy highway through the heart of old Hatfield for centuries, was moved, and where the town's noisy brewery had once stood became placid Salisbury Square. But we were now in the age of the new. Factories such as toy maker Lone Star were booming.
Boom time in a Hatfield toy factory. Record orders to meet. Ingots of zinc are the raw material, going in at one end of the production line, soon to emerge after a score of processes as firearms and many other things dear to a boy's heart. 70% of the output goes for export. For every rifle packed, there'll be a very pleased youngster on Christmas morning. Toy cars are among the best sellers both at home and abroad, and as much care goes into their production as on the real thing. As a result of this quality, Britain has cornered the market in places like America, Germany and Australia. And with all their working parts, the cars are just as appealing to grown-ups.
Meanwhile, Hollier's dairy delivered milk to almost everyone. And the entire centre of the new town was changing. A huge Woolco store, now Asda, severed St Albans Road, and new shops replaced houses. Signs bearing long familiar names disappeared, replaced by branches of multiple chain stores in a pattern familiar across Britain. But the twice-weekly market continued, its stall holders and shoppers almost certainly unaware that they were part of a continuing tradition that stretched back more than 700 years. And not only homes and businesses appeared, a striking swim centre and the Forum were built, and other new leisure outlets opened. As Hatfield Philharmonic Orchestra played on, our single remaining cinema bowed to the inevitable and became a bingo hall. With its special royal connections, Hatfield joined in enthusiastically as Britain celebrated the 25th anniversary of the reign of Elizabeth II. Countless street parties were held, including the one in Park Close for all residents of the Old Town. Among the children sitting down to cakes and jellies were Lord Salisbury's grandchildren, distant descendants of Lord Burleigh, advisor and friend of the first Queen Elizabeth. And the following year, Elizabeth II planted a sapling on the site of the oak tree in Hatfield Park, under which her Tudor ancestor had heard her destiny. After the comet, de Havilland production continued with yet another revolutionary design, the Trident, which featured a first, an automatic landing system.
Estimate 1 minute, over 50. As you report passing beacon held for radar to annihilate 10 right.
This is the flight deck of the de Havilland Trident. A flight deck designed for the eventual introduction of automatic landing and to simplify the operating tasks of flying a high-speed airliner in the dense traffic of short-haul air routes.
The Trident was a faster aeroplane than the Comet when the idea was that British European Airways, who were the first people for which the Trident was built, wanted to have the fastest European airliner and to be able to operate reliably in all weathers and particularly in fog. In those days, it's rather strange, but in the 1960s, when the Trident flew, there used to be much more fog in this country and in Europe than there is today, but particularly in this country. The atmosphere is much clearer and better today. So it was decided that the Trident would be a higher speed aeroplane than the Comet, and it would have this automatic landing system designed and developed, which was an absolutely marvelous hard work by the various people involved, and proved to be the leader, really, in the automatic landing world.
Over to the pilot. We are now lined up on the ILS beam, in line with the runway. We're descending down the glide path, and we have completed the checklist. That is, we have lowered the undercarriage and flaps and made all the actions necessary to carry out an automatic landing. Our test pilot is acting as co-pilot for this flight, and he is monitoring the performance of the system. Normally, for an operational approach, both pilots would be doing this job. At the moment, we're passing 450 feet on the radio altimeters, and this means that we have approximately 1.5 miles to run to touchdown. The autopilot is controlling the airplane, the flight path of the airplane, and the automatic throttles on the 2 outboard engines are controlling the speed of the airplane. We're now passing 200 feet with 3/4 mile to run. The landing will commence at 65 feet, at which point the throttles will close and the autopilot will pitch the nose of the airplane up for the landing flare. The flare is now beginning, and we should very shortly be touching down round about now.
The DH-146, which became, I think, the British Aerospace 146, and which flew in August 1981, was the ultimate de Havilland aircraft. And it's still in production, and in fact it has now become the most successful British jetliner, more successful than the 111, which was the previous bestseller. I think the score is now 350 sold. Production, of course, has moved up to Manchester, to Woodford, but it's a 70 to 100 seat regional jet, and it's, if you like, the wide body of the regional routes. It's got a big wide fuselage with capacity for 6 abreast seats, which is most unusual in that market. So it's very comfortable to fly in, and this is one of the reasons why it's selling. The other reason, I think, is that it's got 4 engines, which gives a very safe performance from what's called hot and high airfield strips, and also from downtown city airports where you have to climb out steeply and land, and do so with a very low noise level. And so all those technical features which were foreseen as being necessary by the de Havilland Company in the late 70s with their project design DH-146 have now paid off.
But the 146 was the last hurrah. In the 1980s, what would have been unthinkable to an earlier generation happened. The plane makers left. Their legacy is more than 60 years when Hatfield was at the furthest frontiers of flight. But the royal connection continued when the Prince of Wales attended a charity dinner at the Old Palace, accompanied by his wife, Diana, whose death was later to stun the world. Alongside the new town, something else disappeared, the A1. A 60 major diversions coped with traffic driving to and from London, the longest road tunnel of its type in Europe was built. In less than 3 years, 82,000 cubic meters of concrete and 10,000 tons of steel created nearly a mile of underground highway. Only weeks before traffic began to roar through the tunnel, Hatfield was given a day out in it. Stalls and sideshows lined the walls, and for the only time people walked and children skated on the latest successor to a road that had once carried stagecoaches through the town.
I now have great pleasure in declaring the tunnel open.
By the time the Duke of Kent officially opened the tunnel in December 1986, the stone house, a town landmark for years, had been demolished. But where it had stood, the new shape of constantly changing Hatfield appeared. the Carroll Group was selected to build the Galleria shopping and leisure mall on top of the tunnel. Despite early problems, it now attracts shoppers from all over Hertfordshire and has provided a multi-screen replacement to our long-lost cinema. And the Galleria looks out over yet another change. Opened as Hatfield Technical College by the Duke of Edinburgh in 1952, it later became Hatfield Polytechnic and launched the first British degree course in computer sciences. Since 1992, it has been the University of Hertfordshire, now with 18,000 students from 100 countries. It is now our town's biggest employer. Meanwhile, new enterprise was taking root. Gray's Garage, which had links back to the earliest days of motoring, was replaced by Diamond Rover.
The reason for Diamond picking Hatfield perhaps over any of the other towns in the locality, which all geographically would have fitted into the territory that we were looking at, was Hatfield's kind of locational benefits in relation to London, access to the north, the strategic road network. Our community relationship is something that we've really strived to develop over the last couple of years. We have links with Hatfield Council, and we have the Antiques Roadshow at our dealership every year, where we invite our customers and people from the local community along to have a pleasant evening without us trying to sell anything, just to be part of the premises. We offer, we have a facility, a car showroom, which is very large, and we offer that facility to local groups, to local car owners clubs, just really to use in the evening if they need somewhere that's a little bit bigger than what they have, that they can house a few people for a talk or for a special event. It's free of charge, and we just let them use our premises. Well, Diamond are the largest MG retailer in the UK now, and we're the most successful MG dealership, and following on from that, our Hatfield dealership has sponsored its own race car in the MGF Cup, and we'll be racing at all the major race events around the country.
And nearby Mitsubishi employs more than 350 people at its UK sales and distribution centre for high-tech electronics.
Mitsubishi Electric moved to Hatfield in 1988 in March, and the reasons for that was that we moved through expansion from our facilities in Rickmansworth to a site that was near there, so that we could, of course, maintain employment retention. But also it was a greenfield site. The transportation infrastructure around Hatfield was good for our company in terms of central London and also Heathrow Airport, and also because of the facility of the university, at that time Polytechnic. We are involved in supporting the Hatfield Festival, which is a yearly event. We're involved in the understanding of industry, where we go into schools and attempt to make school children aware of business reality. And we are involved in the Business Bridge, which is a link between the business link and the business in the community. And we are involved also with placements of undergraduate students from the university.
And with one of those wry twists that history throws up, the place once mockingly called California became part of Hollywood. In 1997, Steven Spielberg shot scenes for Saving Private Ryan on the abandoned de Havilland runway. A strikingly realistic French village was created, then bombed, and Hatfield found itself temporary host to superstar Tom Hanks. Steven Spielberg later commented, "I was personally delighted with the British aerospace site at Hatfield. It made Saving Private Ryan a reality, and an enjoyable one at that. It's rare to find such an ideal site so close to a major city. It's an asset you should capitalize on." And where the wartime past was being recreated, Hatfield's future was taking shape. The wide and vacant de Havilland site was being turned into a business park, with modern industries making their homes in our town. Where did our story begin? With the monks of Ely and a handful of obscure Saxon peasants more than 1,000 years ago. Since then, statesmen and monarchs have known our town, and a famous queen learnt that her reign had begun here. We can even claim at least a footnote in English literature. We saw the birth of the tank and produced a plane that helped to win a war, before Hatfield led the world into a new age of flight. When the Doomsday Book was written, our ancestors herded pigs. Today, we create high technology. But history never stops, and Hatfield enters another millennium as one of Britain's boom towns. Its unemployment low, its hopes high. We have tasted triumph and survived disaster. Who knows what the next 1,000 years of Hatfield's history will bring? Our very eventful journey goes on.